Hi, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world. By all means, type in the chat. Let us know where you are. I'm Catherine Mattice. I'm the founder and CEO of Civility Partners. We focus on building positive work environments, and I am super excited today to have Sheila Eason with me. She's with Elevate People Solutions, and we met because we are both boss whisperers. Many of you know that I specialize in coaching executives and leaders who have been accused of bullying or harassment. And Sheila is in that same group and does that as well. So thanks, Sheila, for being with me today.
Thank you so much, Catherine. I'm excited to be here.
Yeah. And you're also part of the Maxwell Leadership Team. Is that right?
I am, yes. So I received my certification in August of 2020. And so, yes, I enjoyed every minute of it. In fact, we have a conference coming up next week that I'll be attending virtually.
Ooh, I have heard lots of good things about that. So something to explore at some point in the future. We've got lots of comments coming through. We've got Kansas, Brazil, Nebraska,
Awesome.
Istanbul,
Wow.
Sacramento. We've got lots of fun people coming. Switzerland, Texas. So
Awesome.
hi all. Thanks for joining us. And please, we want this to be interactive. So I've got some questions for Sheila. Please type yours in and I will ask them so that we can make sure that we get your questions answered as well. So Sheila and I are going to talk about microaggressions and unconscious bias and all of that important stuff. So Sheila, the biases they're kind of like stereotypes, and then they influence us in ways that we aren't even aware of really. Where does unconscious bias come from?
So unconscious bias, they're really triggered by our brains making automatic assumptions. So for instance, if you walk into a crowded room and you see, lots of people in that room, our brain begins to categorize and try to figure out, okay, are those the young people, or more seasoned people, or those the black people, white people, or what have you. So our brains are triggered to make these assumptions and to categorize people.
Why?
They
Why do
also
we do that? Oh, go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to say they also are influenced by our upbringing. So based on how we were brought up, if you think about that, if you were brought up in a house where there was, I'll just say, colorful language. So for instance, if, I do this exercise, let me use this example. I do this exercise in my training where I ask people to get into groups. I put them into groups and I say, talk about where you grew up. What kind of messages did you receive about people who were different than you when you were growing up? And how have those messages influenced you in your life? And so it's really interesting because I've heard lots of people say, well, I grew up in a rural town where there were not a lot of diversity. There was not a lot of diversity there. So there were not a lot of people who looked different than me. And those who were, we heard different messages. Some of my family members use racial epithets or, made other statements. So it's triggered by our upbringing, our environment. It's, triggered by the different types of groups or associations that we may be involved in as we, grow up. So there's a lot of different ways. One of the biggest influences is the media. So if you think about this, the things that you see, whether it's on the television, you hear about it on the radio, or social media, plays a big role in the biases that we form against people.
And we make these kind of quick decisions because we don't really know it, right? We often don't have any idea.
Absolutely, because it's happening outside of our awareness. That's why they're called unconscious bias, because we're not even realizing that it's happening when it's happening.
Yeah. Okay. Just thinking about something like the media, I've been watching a documentary on Netflix, one of their many, and they keep showing news clips from back in the 80s when all of this stuff was going on. And I've really been noticing there are no people of color. They are all white people with brown hair, you know, and it's just kind of really standing out to me. But in the 80s when that was going on, people maybe, or at least white people probably didn't even notice, right? And so
exactly.
kind of thing. Yeah.
Well, think about this. So if, you watch the evening news or the morning news, or you read the paper, and if you hear, I'll just use an example. If you see Black men committing acts of crime, and that's all you see, and you don't see the Black men who are actually taking care of their families and gainfully employed, but that's all you see, you begin to believe that that represents all Black men. Right. So the media does play a tremendous role, even if you think about from the standpoint of females. If you look at some of the commercials, and how females are portrayed, if you don't know any better, you assume that all females are this way or all females are that way. So yeah, the media, and that's why I always tell people, make sure you have the full story. There's always two sides to a story, and it's never just what you see, but you have to be willing to research and to talk to other people. So, for instance, if there's a certain group, ethnic or otherwise, that perhaps you have certain stereotypes or biases about, research, talk to other people and find out, is that really true? And you'll probably find that it's not accurately represented.
Right. On the few and far between commercials I see lately, just thinking about your gender comment, used to be in the 80s when we had commercials and watched TV like that, the commercials for the laundry soap and the dish soap and stuff were always the woman, the stay-at-home mom kind of a thing. And so I've been happy to see here and there kind of the stay-at-home dad vibe coming through, or that dad's also doing the dishes in these commercials.
Absolutely. And just one more comment about that. Sure. Speaking of commercials, I have noticed a lot lately that commercials are representing people of all aspects of diversity in non-traditional roles. And I think that is very important to change that dynamic.
Yes, I agree. We have a question. So here it is. When talking about racism, I was recently asked, it's great to be responsible to make sure nobody feels ill-treated, but should the onus be a little bit on the person on the receiving end to not take everything seriously because there was no ill intention behind a comment? So if someone makes a racist comment, are we allowed to be offended, I guess, is the kind of the question. And do we need to, is it up to the other person to maybe not be offended? That's a great question. I'd love to hear your answer, Sheila.
It's a really great question. I'll explain it this way. Typically, what happens with marginalized groups, and what I mean by marginalized groups, I mean based on race, gender, members of the LGBTQ community, with disabilities, even people I'll call over 40, and you know what I mean by that, but people who are more seasoned. So typically what happens is they experience microaggressions on a regular basis. And now I'm kind of mentioning that. And so what happens when someone is experiencing microaggressions on a regular basis, that affects them psychologically. It affects them, their self-esteem. It affects how they see themselves. And so the response that one may, if they say something that is offensive, the response that one may receive may just be a response based on the fact that the person is constantly dealing with microaggressions. So, microaggressions are described as death by 1,000 paper cuts, because they cut over and over and over again. So while the individual who's making the comment may not have any intention to offend, that may be what the response is about. So the second part of that question is, we all have a responsibility to ensure that we are educating one another. So if someone says something offensive to me, then I may be hurt by it, but I also have a responsibility to them why it hurt me. What
Mhm.
what was it that they said? What was the meaning behind it that I took from it? And I think
Mhm.
that that's an important part of microaggressions, that we understand it's not just what's said or what's done, but it also represents the meaning behind it, and how is that person perceiving what was said or done. So, but yes, we do all, I believe, have a responsibility, because how are people going to know what to do differently unless we help them understand?
Yeah. I really appreciate your answer. And I think too, we could say, like when we have a fight with our spouse or a partner or a friend, we could have that same response of like, well, I didn't intend to hurt your feelings, so you shouldn't be hurt. But we have a responsibility to educate each other. And the person who said the comment has a responsibility to be open-minded enough to hear what the other person has to say. So I think none of us really goes around intentionally hurting people. I mean, you and I know, Sheila, as coaches of bullies, people who are accused of that
Right.
behavior, even that's not intentional most of the time. Sometimes we come across someone that seems to not really care about the impact they have, but for the most part, they're pretty appalled. So I think intent, and someone says it's important to center impact over intent. And I agreed. Intention really is kind of irrelevant most of the time, especially because most of us aren't intending to cause harm. And I think too, isn't it possible that microaggressions, they're often sort of about trying to build rapport? Like the intent is actually to build a relationship. I was talking to a Hispanic, he was a real estate broker, and he was talking about how he lived down in San Diego in a part that's very down in Chula Vista. That's right by the border. It's full of a lot of people with who are Hispanic or from Mexico. And so he specifically moved up more north where it's more white so that he could stand out. And that was the point. But he said that people would always, when they'd meet him and shake his hand, they'd always say something like, oh, you're Mexican. I have a friend who's Mexican. And he would just joke and say, oh, that's funny. I have a friend and a dad who's Mexican, and my mom's Mexican. And he'd kind of make light of it. But
Yeah.
he, because he knew they were just looking for a way to connect with them. And it wasn't intended to be like, oh, you're Mexican and you're an other, even though that's ultimately the message that comes through. Yeah.
Yeah. And I do. Oh, I'm sorry.
Oh,
I
no,
was
go
just
ahead.
going to say, I do agree that there are times when someone is trying to make a connection, or they're trying to build that common ground. So to
Yeah.
say, hey, I have a friend who's Mexican. I think where we have to be more consciously aware of it is when we're making comments that are off of stereotypes.
Yeah.
So it's okay to say, I have a family member who's Mexican, if we're trying to, make a connection. But then when we take it too far and say, oh, and I love Mexican food, and do you love Mexican food? And what about that Mexican restaurant down the corner? Don't you just love it? Because it's making assumptions, right? So it's
Yeah.
categorizing and saying, well, all Mexicans must love the same thing.
Yeah. Yeah. Fair enough. We've got lots of
Yeah,
comments, lots of people talking
sure.
about intent versus impact and appreciating our
Absolutely.
answers here. Let's see. Someone says, can we have an in-person session on this? Yes, Sheila and I are both available for hire as trainers. So reach out.
Absolutely.
Let's
Yes.
see. Someone says, I think the caveat to educating people is doing so when one feels safe psychologically or physically enough to do so. And that's a very
Yes.
good point. It's hard for us to stand
Absolutely.
up and also be open-minded from the other end if we're not feeling safe.
Yeah.
Yes. And then,
Psychological safety is absolutely important. We have to feel that if I speak up, going to be attacked. And I think that that is one of the reasons why the person who was hurt or offended has to be careful. We want to make sure that we're educating people and letting them know why what you said or did hurt me. but I don't want to attack you, because then that's going to create a wall, a barrier where you're no longer going to feel safe with me. And that's not what we want.
Yeah. Yeah. And this comment, people should take the initiative to educate themselves in other ways, like a LinkedIn Learning Office Hour. Indeed. Yeah. So we all need to be educating ourselves about others. And that's how we're going to get to a point where we all, get along better. And because we're all going to misstep. We all are throughout our whole lives.
Absolutely.
There's just no way we wouldn't. But the more open-minded we can be to hearing what others have to say about why we might have offended, the more we can take it upon ourselves to educate ourselves, we can kind of minimize some of our impact that may be negative. I got a question for you about organizations. I mean, what can organizations do around unconscious bias and, that second piece of microaggressions that I think those two things kind of go hand in hand? How can organizations really address this? Because I know everyone did training at Black Lives Matter. What now?
Yeah, and that's a great question. And I receive that a lot because some organizations issue statements. You mentioned Black Lives Matter. And some organizations issue statements. And I think that's a good thing to do. But then where's the action, right? Mm-hmm. So I think that organizations, first of all, need to start with assessing their organization, assessing, where they are in terms of diversity, equity, inclusion, belonging, access, all of those different areas. And to really ask their employees, how diverse are we? Do you feel that we have equitable systems and policies in place? Do you feel that you belong here? And if you do, why? What gives you that sense of belonging? So I think it first of all starts with an assessment. And then from that assessment, you take that data and then you institute an action plan. Part of that action plan will include training, but training is not the only thing. The training is not the solution, particularly if an organization is only doing it one-off, right? You know this, even with harassment. If you're just doing the training to check the box, you're not going to move the needle at all. So training is one element of it, but what else are you doing? Are you looking at your systems? Are organizations looking at where there may be implicit bias embedded in their systems? For instance, their hiring practices, their promotional practices. So, you really have to, I think it starts with that assessment and then developing an action plan as to how do we address these gaps.
Yes, I agree. And that's with anything. I mean, culture, you want to create a customer service culture. It's not just training. Absolutely. You want to create a culture of innovation. It's not just training. Yes. You want to create a culture of inclusivity and equity. It's not just training. And I am always fascinated. I'm sure you get this too, the phone call. This happened. Can you come do a training? It's like, yes. And that's probably not going to really influence the situation.
Right. You have to understand what's driving those behaviors.
Yeah, we have some other great comments and questions. I'm going to jump to Melanie's question. From your experience, Sheila, what is the best way to implement unconscious bias addressing unconscious bias in the hiring practices? Can you give us maybe one or two really specific things that we could do?
Yeah. So there are many different types of unconscious bias that shows up in the hiring practices. I'll just name a couple. Affinity bias. And affinity bias is where individuals towards individuals who are like them and in whatever respect, whether it's race or gender. It's not just those things. Maybe I gravitate towards people who graduated from college from my alma mater, because I believe that they're more qualified. In fact, I do know an organization that has preference for hiring individuals from certain colleges, right? And so what happens with that is you get groupthink and you don't get that diversity of thought. So that can happen. Also, there's similar to me bias. There is halo, the halo effect, and the halo effect can affect not only our hiring practices, but also our performance management systems. Because what it says is, or the theory behind it is, you see something that's glowing about someone, something that is, really fantastic about them, and you everything else.
Mm-hmm.
So there may be some glaring red flags about that individual in the interview, but because of this one characteristic about them or quality that you really, really like, you ignore everything else. And it happens the opposite as well. The Horns effect, where, maybe someone was nervous initially, and maybe the interview started off a little bit tentative, and you've just discounted that individual. Maybe they just said something that maybe you didn't like, and you just discount them. And no matter how well they do in the rest of the interview, there's nothing that they can say that can turn you around. There's confirmation bias. This is the last one that I'll mention, where we have a certain impression about individuals, and we look for evidence to confirm that. A perfect example is, think about millennials. And we all have heard, different things said about millennials, that they're entitled, that they don't want to work hard. They're always on their phones and so forth like that. So let's say you have a millennial who can interview, and you already believe these things about that millennial. You're going to look for evidence what you believe, and it doesn't matter anything else. You're looking for that evidence to prove yourself right. Those are, just a few examples of how bias shows up in our hiring, in really our entire talent management processes.
So if I'm interviewing somebody tomorrow, how can I make sure I avoid those things or minimize them to the best of my ability? What's a tip for me in that interview? Is it really just being aware that it's possible, and so I need to pick through the interview, or sort of self-assess after it's over to kind of think through, did that really happen? Did I really, what are your thoughts?
It starts with awareness. So understanding what are the various types of bias that can show up. But I also believe in using interview panels. So where you have 2 or 3 individuals conducting the interview, so that you have different perspectives. I believe it's also important that you challenge one another. So if I'm on an interview with you, Catherine, and I have a bias that shows up, I want you to challenge me, right? And we have to get comfortable with doing, well, I'm not sure that, that is the right decision. Can you tell me why you think that way? And just begin to have some conversation about it. So I think those are 2 of the primary ways. I know a lot of organizations are also using quote unquote blind interviews, where they're taking all of the identifiable information off of resumes. So, you don't know whether it's a male or a female. You don't know the person's race, gender, age, all of those different types of things. If someone lists on there that they're a member of a mom's organization, you take that information off, because you don't want someone to make about moms that they're not going to be available, or if the baby gets sick, they're going to be calling off all the time. So you take off any information someone to make a biased decision, and all the hiring manager is receiving is a candidate. They don't know anything else.
I like that. I got to say too, and I'm seeing some of these comments in here that lead me to believe, and I think a lot of times people equate unconscious bias to really race and gender, because those are big topics right now. But when I do an unconscious bias training, I show a video where it's a really short guy and a really tall guy, and they look almost the same. They found these sort of twins. So they look very similar, and they're wearing the same exact thing. They're both wearing a gray sweatshirt and black jeans. And then they went around New York City separately and asked people, how much do you think I make? What do you think my job title is? And the tall guy was being told they thought he was the CEO and, the CFO, all these big titles. And he was ultimately the average that people were assigning to him was that he made around $300,000 a year. And this little short guy, it's kind of sad to watch. One lady says, I think he's probably a cook at a fast food restaurant. People equated him to only making $60,000 a year. And so that was based on height. So that's I think that halo effect, or the attribution bias, where we make a decision about somebody based on some sort of attribute that they have, which could be skin color or gender, but it's not just that. And we all do it. Right? Yeah.
Weight is another.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Gosh, there are so many comments coming through. I love this. And we only have 4 minutes left. So I'm going to pick on, I saw this one earlier that was a little controversial. So I'm going to ask it. Danny, I love your question or comment. He says that since all bias is unconscious, I feel that prefixing that unconscious bias or adding unconscious in front of bias somehow removes the responsibility for the impact of our actions. What do you think about that? Should we just say bias, or do we need to be saying unconscious bias?
I think the reason why you have unconscious in front of bias is just so that it explains how it happens, that it happens outside of our awareness. But I believe you said his name is Danny. To his point, we don't want to forget the impact. We don't want to minimize the impact that the bias or the microaggression has on an individual. I'll just say this real quickly. I often get questions about the term microaggressions. Well, if they're so hurtful, why is it called micro? And micro just speaks to not the impact, but it just speaks to that it happens on an individual level. The macro is where it's happening on a larger scale. So it only defines how it happens, but it doesn't describe the impact. And I always like to make that point in my trainings because Danny is absolutely right. We don't want to focus so much on terminology that minimizes the impact, because they are hurtful situations.
Yeah. Thank you for that. And there's another great comment here that I want to respond to it as well. So Andrea, hopefully I said your name right. She says, he or she says, a lot of us are exhausted at the assumed responsibility of educating. And so self-preservation kicks and choices are made to just take a step back when it comes to DEI. So I hear you, and I do feel that there's a sense of exhaustion sometimes around this topic. But on the flip side, as professionals, we're always seeking new information about leadership and management skills. Communication skills have been a popular training for thousands of years. So I think it just fits right in there. And I think it feels exhausting because it has been in our face a lot lately, which is important because we need to be reminded that this is part of people skills, and it's a part of people skills that maybe has been ignored for a long time. So that's kind of my thought on it. I think it's, just like anything, it's just a process over time that we got to get better and better at. It doesn't mean you have to go out and read everything tomorrow so that you can talk to people who are different than you. It's a process, just like building your leadership skills. I don't know if you agree with that, Sheila, but that's my thought on that comment.
I just like to make one quick comment. And let me preface what I'm about to say by saying this. I'm not calling adults children. I'm using an analogy.
Okay.
Children, my son, who we just dropped off at college for his freshman year over the past weekend, I've had to tell him the same thing over and over and over, particularly throughout his high school years. And it can be exhausting. But what I know is that the seeds that I've planted in him are there. And when it's time for it to manifest, it will. And so while as a parent, it can be exhausting telling him over and over again, what to do, what not to do about his friends and so forth. It's part of my responsibility to ensure that I'm raising a good, productive, respectful citizen, who is living. And so, yes, it can be exhausting educating people, but I think we have a responsibility to do so.
I love that. That's a great analogy because, man, I'm tired of telling my 8-year-old stuff. I got a long way to go. Anyways, well, we have to pop off. Our time has come to an end, but Sheila, there are a ton more comments in there, so I encourage you to go in there and chat back. Because this is evergreen. It will be here on this page forever. I'll also do that. Okay. And all of you, I encourage you to reach out to Sheila and or I. Obviously our LinkedIn profiles are there on this page. And really appreciate all of the great comments. I think we could probably just do a part 2. So we'll schedule that.
Absolutely. I'd love to. And thank you everyone for being on.
Yeah. And give us real quick, what is your website so people know where to find you there?
www.elevatepeoplesolutions.com.
Okay, elevatepeoplesolutions.com.
And I can type it in. Can I type in the chat?
You can after. I think you can after close it. Okay. So you can do that. All right. Thanks again, all. Thank you, Sheila. This was fantastic.